Welcome to Cause Before Symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carner.
Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carner. Today is January 10th, 2026, and tonight's episode is all about Part 6, Examination of Joshua, the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox and King James Comparison. Now, I'm not sure if you guys saw, but I was having some technical difficulties earlier. Nothing was working, man. My mic was all off, everything. I had to unplug, reboot, and do all that stuff, but I'm here. Hopefully, you guys can hear me. I'll leave it up to you for you to tell me so. Anyway, so tonight, Joshua is not a book about God becoming violent. It's a book about promise becoming reality and about what happens when faith must move from belief into action. Well, the same events appear in both the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox record and the King James Bible. But the way those events are voiced can determine whether Joshua is heard as a story of divine rage and conquest or as a measured completion of covenant governed by order, restraint, warning, and mercy. This book stands at the critical threshold here. Moses has died. The law has been spoken. Memory has been secured. What remains is obedience lived under pressure in a land already marked by long-standing judgment and long-standing patience. Joshua does not introduce a new divine posture. It carries forward what was already declared, revealing whether judgment unfolds impulsively or within limits that preserve continuity, choice, and accountability. Now, Joshua continues battles, destruction, and loss, but it also contains pauses, inclusion, covenant honor, internal correction, and repeated calls to remember. Remember that their parents literally should have remembered and all of the events that happened and what God was trying to get them to understand. Remember your past. Now, Rahab is spared. Oaths are kept even when inconvenient. Excess is restrained. The land is apportioned carefully rather than seized recklessly. The narrative itself resists being reduced to holy violence when the language is allowed to speak in sequence. This examination exists because Joshua has often been used to portray God as angry, volatile, and indiscriminate. When the wording is heard carefully, especially alongside the Ethiopian canonical tradition, a whole different picture emerges. Judgment that is bounded, mercy that is active within consequence, and a God who remains consistent with everything he revealed before the Jordan was crossed. Now, Joshua ultimately asks whether obedience in the land is driven by fear of God's wrath or trust in God's faithfulness. How the language carries command, victory, failure, and covenant renewal determines whether readers learn to associate God with domination or with faithful governance under severe conditions. So this episode slows Joshua down so it can be heard as it was meant to be heard, not as justification for violence, but as testimony that promise, once given, will be fulfilled without God abandoning restraint, mercy, or covenant integrity, even when judgment must occur. So I'm excited about tonight's show. It's going to be a long one, so buckle in your spurs, buttercup. Shout out to everybody on the live chat Rumble. Number one warrior is Scorpion saying, "What's up, Pastor and Warrior family?" What's going on, Scorpion? Love you, buddy. Number two is Boots Hafner stating, "Hello, let's get ready to rumble with your host of the Rumble airwaves and creator of Elite Post, James Carner." That's me. Hello, fellow warriors. Nice to meet you here. And let's all hit that thumbs up button for James. Yes, I'm going to do it too. Hit X, hit thumbs up, which I just did, and then hit live chat. You won't lose your spot. Number three warrior is Surfer Wife saying, "Hey, family, happy Saturday. Such an awesome day. Thank you, James. Or thank you, Jesus, for another day." I didn't mean to replace my name with Jesus. Forgive me, Lord. And then Surfer Wife says, "Yep, she can hear me loud and clear." Boots says they can hear me loud and clear, so we're rocking and a rolling. So let's get into breaking news.
Welcome to Shitty Breaking News with your host, James Carner, offering his shitty opinion.
Well, it is. So tonight's breaking news is not a collection of isolated events. Just like every other night, it reads like a pressure map of the world itself, showing where authority is tightening, where people are resisting, and where truth is being managed instead of spoken. Now, across these 5 stories tonight, I can't do 10 because I just don't have enough time. The same question keeps surfacing. Will systems harden or will hearts awaken? Well, the first and most urgent story tonight comes out of Iran, where the government has moved to restrict or shut down internet access as protests continue to grow across multiple cities. Bad idea. Don't shut off their internet. Now, when a state cuts communication, it is not acting from strength at all, but from fear. And in New World Order terms, this reflects a global pattern where information control is treated as national security. I've been seeing a lot of people who are from Iran, and they are thinking that this is a huge new revolution that's going to start. Iran is going to be a changed country after this. I don't know, but it sure looks like it. Now, the less people can see and speak, the easier they are to manage. That's why they're shutting the internet off. So for the children of God, this is a sobering reminder that truth does not depend on bandwidth. Scripture was preserved under empires far more brutal than this. Believe me, it was worse. And the word has never required permission to endure. Now, our response here is prayer for courage, protection, and wisdom for those whose voices are being silenced, especially in Iran. So pray for the people of Iran and pray that they find the truth and pray that they can take their country back from these leaders who are from Russia and from Israel. Remember, I told you, Iran has been split into 2. There's northern and southern Iran. Now, nobody knows this, but all the world leaders do. And Russia controls northern Iran and Israel controls southern Iran. Long story. Now, the second story tonight unfolds across the Middle East, where instability continues in multiple theaters at once. Syria remains fractured. Well, they lost their leader, and they're going to lose probably half their state to Israel, as Israel's already mapped it out on their patches that they wear on their military arms. But it's fractured, and Yemen is again shifting under collapsing leadership, and the region shows no sign of real resolution, meaning Israel's coming in and Israel is expanding. In New World Order terms, prolonged instability is not always a failure of diplomacy. Sometimes it is a feature. Endless conflict keeps populations dependent, border fluid, and external powers relevant. For the Christian walk, this is where discernment guards the heart from fatigue. We are called to intercede without becoming numb, to grieve without becoming cynical, and to remember that peace imposed by force is not peace that Jesus Christ promised. The third major development tonight comes from Eastern Europe, where fighting in Ukraine has intensified again, including renewed strikes on infrastructure and civilian areas. Murder, murder, murder. Each escalation further erodes the idea that war can be contained or managed cleanly. In New World Order terms, Ukraine remains a proving ground for modern warfare, where territory, technology, and endurance are tested simultaneously. For the children of God, this is a call to resist the temptation to turn suffering into strategy. Lives are not leverage, and prayer for mercy must never be replaced by loyalty to narratives, meaning don't vote for Russia and don't vote for Ukraine. Both of them are in the bad, and they both know it. The fourth story shifts to the economic and legal realm in the United States, where a looming Supreme Court decision on tariffs could ripple through global trade and financial markets. Now, this is a reminder that courts, not just armies or executives, actually shape the world order. And in New World Order terms, economic law has become a battlefield where power is enforced quietly through regulation, precedent, and compliance. This is why presidents need to stack the Supreme Court in their favor, because there's a left and there's a right. And the left part of the Supreme Court are controlled by China. The right is controlled by the Orsinis in Europe. Now, for believers, this is a moment to examine where trust truly rests. Market rises and falls, policies change, but provision comes from God. So if anything happens from all of this, stop worrying. God can send you manna. God can send you food from birds. You have to just be in faith with it. And faith is an action, not from favorable rulings or economic engineering either. Now, the fifth story tonight is quieter, but no less revealing. Severe winter storms all across Europe have disrupted transportation power and daily life. This is reminding millions of how fragile modern systems really are. In New World Order terms, natural events often become accelerants for expanded emergency powers and centralized response. All right. Crisis invites control. And for the children of God, this is a call to complete humility and compassion for your neighbor. Creation still answers to its creator, period. The devil is not in control. He just thinks he is. And not to forecast or for policy plans, but for moments like this, to invite us to serve neighbors rather than surrender to fear. So tonight, taken all together, these top 5 stories reveal a world under strain, not collapsing, but tightening. Information is being managed, conflict prolonged, economies agitated, and emergencies leveraged. Now, for the children of God, the response remains steady and unchanged. Watch without panic, pray without ceasing, love without condition. And remember that no system, no empire, and no headline has the final word.
Why do 75% of people feel exhausted all the time? The answer might surprise you. In the 1920s, Standard Oil decided to dive into medicine. They pushed synthetic petroleum into our drugs. Sure, it masked symptoms, but it wrecked our guts. Our good bacteria, which fight off parasites and heavy metals, got wiped out by crude oil. But here's the good news. We can fix this by going back to nature. Introducing Elite Potion, the world's top detox program. It restores your good bacteria by removing toxic threats like aluminum, strontium, barium, and parasites. Imagine feeling energized and alive again. They said there couldn't be a pill that did it all. We invented it. Visit elitepotion.com and reclaim your health from synthetic pharmaceuticals. Your body will thank you.
Every year, millions of Americans sign a contract they don't even know exists. They think it's just another tax return, but that signature means something far deeper. It starts with that first job at 16. The system takes a piece of her check, then promises to give some back if she signs the return. Every April 15th, the same cycle repeats, not by law, but by belief. The system didn't bind them, their own signature did. Learn the truth at unincorporatedassociations.com.
All right, we're back. Tonight we're focusing on Joshua. All right. So Joshua begins in silence as Moses is gone, and the voice that carried the law through wilderness and memory is no longer present. What stands before the people now is not a new revelation, but the weight of everything they have already heard. This is the moment where belief must become action, and action will expose whether faith has been rooted in trust or merely in familiarity. Now, Joshua is often read as a book where God's tone shifts, where patience gives way to aggression and covenant gives way to conquest. But that assumption comes from reading events without listening carefully to how they are actually carried. Joshua does not introduce a harsher God. It reveals what obedience looks like when it must be lived in a contested space, under pressure, and without the mediating presence of Moses. This book exists because promises cannot remain abstract forever. The land promised to Abraham, reaffirmed to Isaac, Jacob, and Moses, must eventually be entered or abandoned. Joshua stands at that intersection. The people are no longer learning who God is. They are learning whether they trust him enough to walk forward when obedience has visible cost. Now, the severity in Joshua is real, and it must not be denied. Cities fall, lives are lost, judgment occurs. But the question this examination asks is whether that severity is chaotic or governed, impulsive or restrained. The language matters because it determines whether readers hear rage or order, vengeance or consequence, domination or fulfillment. Joshua also reveals something uncomfortable. Obedience does not remove difficulty. Crossing the Jordan does not end conflict. Faith does not produce immediate peace. And what it produces is clarity. The people know that what has been commanded, and now their faith is measured by alignment rather than endurance alone. One of the most revealing features of Joshua is how often the narrative actually slows down. Before Jericho falls, instructions are given and followed exactly. Before I think it's the town Ai, before Ai is taken, internal failure is exposed and corrected. And before land is distributed, boundaries are measured and named correctly. These pauses are not incidental. They reveal a God who governs process, not a God who erupts in fury. And again, tonight we're going to be explaining the difference between the Ethiopian canon wording and the King James wording. And believe me, one of them makes God really pissed. Now, the inclusion of Rahab exposes the heart of the book early. Judgment is unfolding, yet mercy is already active. Covenant lines are crossed in unexpected ways, and God honors faith even when it emerges from outside Israel. Joshua does not present a closed system of destruction. It presents a moment where alignment still matters more than origin. This book also refuses to let victory obscure accountability. Israel does not triumph unchecked. When obedience fractures internally, progress stops immediately. The God who commands judgment on the land does not excuse disorder within his own people. That consistency matters here because it reveals that God's actions are not driven by favoritism or appetite for violence, but by commitment to covenant integrity. Joshua ends the way it begins, with a choice. The final words are not commands shouted in triumph, but a call to remember, to serve, and to decide whom the people will trust when prosperity replaces urgency. The danger Joshua anticipates is not enemies outside the land, but forgetting within it, their own people. And this examination exists because Joshua has often been read backward through modern assumptions about violence and power. When the language is allowed to speak in sequence, and when the Ethiopian Tewahedo witness is placed alongside the King James, the narrative resists being reduced to anger. And what emerges instead of a God who completes what he promised without abandoning restraint, mercy, or justice. Joshua does not ask readers to celebrate destruction. It asks them to reckon with obedience under pressure. It does not glorify conquest. It reveals the cost of entering promise in a world already marked by long-standing judgment and long-standing patience. The God who leads Israel across the Jordan is the same God who spoke at Sinai and the same God who will later be revealed in his Son, Jesus Christ. If Joshua is heard as rupture, the problem is not the text. It is the way the text has been heard and taught. Joshua stands as a witness here. That promise fulfilled still requires faith, restraint, and remembrance. The land is entered, but not seized. And the God who leads remains faithful, even when the path forward becomes severe. I am excited about these next 50 some odd books we're going to be doing, because not only are we seeing the difference between the Tewahedo Ge'ez to Aramaic to English version, and that version compared with the King James English from Hebrew, well, actually went from Hebrew to Latin to English, and looking at the comparisons, they're pretty close, but the wordings in the Ethiopian canon are so much easier to understand and less in your face, angry God, toll booth Jesus. And so what we're really showing here is we're going to be giving It's 66 shows of the Bible, and each book explained and looked at from the Tewahedo Ethiopian version from the West version. And I'm telling you, there's a big difference, and you can understand God even better. So these are going to be wonderful shows, and I may put it on my website where you can just, download or watch each one in sequence. Now, Joshua does not begin with movement. It begins with continuity. Before a single step is taken into the land, God anchors Joshua's authority in what he already been spoken. This matters because conquest narratives often assume escalation, but Joshua opens by repeating promise, not intensifying command. The land is not newly desired, right? It has already been given to them. Now, in the King James record, Joshua 1:1-3 is framed with decisive authority. I quote, "Now after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spake unto Joshua, saying, Moses my servant is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, every place that the sole of your foot shall tread upon, that have I given unto you." Now, the language can sound abrupt. Arise, go over, read as immediate action following loss. And if heard without any context, the transition can feel forceful, as though momentum replaces mourning. In the Ethiopian Tewahedo record, the same moment is carried with steadier cadence. It says, and I quote, "After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, My servant Moses is dead. Now rise across the Jordan. Every place on which the sole of your foot treads, I have given to you." Now, the command is the same, but the tone rests on continuity rather than urgency. The promise is reaffirmed, but not accelerated. God does not announce a new phrase of domination. He confirms what was already declared. Remember, that land was promised to them by God, and whoever was living there at the time, which we know were the heathens, and they were giants, and their grapes were the size of basketballs, it didn't belong to them anymore. What's going on, Yoda bruh? So that distinction here, it actually matters when spoken aloud, because in one hearing, Joshua appears propelled into action by necessity, and in the other, Joshua steps into an inheritance that has been waiting for him. So there's a big difference between the KGB and the Ethiopian. The land is not seized because Moses is gone. It is entered because the promise remains. Now, God then speaks words that define the posture of the entire book. In the King James, Joshua 1:5 reads, and I quote, "There shall not any man be able to stand before thee all the days of thy life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with thee. I will not fail thee, nor forsake thee." Now, here, strength and victory are named first, and presence then follows. Read quickly, this can sound like assurance of dominance. But in the Ethiopian record, the same promise is voiced with presence at the center. And I quote, Ethiopian, "No one shall be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you nor forsake you." Big difference. The promise of success is grounded of continuity of presence, not superiority of force. Victory is not self-generated. It is derivative of faithfulness. This becomes clearer when courage is commanded. In King James, Joshua 1:6 says, "Be strong and of good cheer, for unto this people shalt thou divide for an inheritance the land." Now here, courage is tied to task and responsibility. In the Ethiopian record, the same command is carried with emphasis on trust rather than pressure. It says, and I quote, "Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land." So Joshua is not being pushed to conquer. He is being entrusted to steward inheritance. God then places a boundary around action. In the King James, Joshua 1:7-8 reads, and I quote, "Only be thou strong and very courageous, that thou mayest observe to do according to all the law. This book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth." So here, obedience is framed as a guardrail. Strength is constrained by alignment. But in the Ethiopian record, The same instruction preserves sequence without compression. It says, and I quote in the Ethiopian, "Only be strong and very courageous, that you may carefully observe all the law. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth." So action is not free form. It is disciplined by remembrance. Courage is not license. It is fidelity under pressure. So Joshua is not commissioned as a conqueror detached from covenant. He is commissioned as a servant bound to it. Success is promised, but only inside obedience, as presence is guaranteed, but not independence. So this opening establishes the pattern for everything that follows. God does not unleash Joshua. He anchors him. He does not remove restraint. He intensifies it. And the promise of the land does not loosen the law. It requires deeper attention to it. Now, if Joshua is later heard as a book of ungoverned violence, this openly already resists that reading. And from the first words spoken after Moses' death, God binds action to memory, courage to obedience, and victory to presence. So Joshua does not step into the land to invest God's will. He steps into it to carry forward what was already spoken. And that continuity, established here, governs the severity that will follow. Now, before Jericho falls, Joshua pauses the narrative in a way that immediately disrupts any reading of this book as reckless conquest. The first decisive act inside the land is not destruction, but discernment. And the first life preserved is not Israelite, but Canaanite. Rahab appears at the very front of the conquest narrative, and her placement is deliberate. In the King James record, Joshua 2:9-11 carries Rahab's confession with striking clarity. It says, and I quote, King James, "I know that the Lord hath given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and in earth beneath." Now, her words are not coerced. She does not speak under threat. She speaks from recognition. Judgment is unfolding, yet faith emerges from within the people being judged. In the Ethiopian Tewahedo record, the same confession is preserved with a cadence that emphasizes understanding rather than fear. It says, and I quote, Ethiopian, "I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that fear of you has fallen upon us. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below." So the substance here is pretty identical, but the tone rests less on panic and more on discernment. Rahab is not reacting to violence already unleashed. She is responding to what she has heard and understood about God's acts, as she has seen it and heard it and understands it, and she knows her city is under judgment. And so instead of rallying with her city and pushing the spies out the window, she helped them and then helped them escape. So that difference matters here because in one hearing, Rahab sounds like a survivor making a desperate calculation. But in the other, she sounds like a witness who has already concluded something true about God, as her faith is not transactional, it's declarative. She aligns herself with what she believes is real, not merely with what is powerful. Rahab then makes a request, and the wording here shapes how covenant mercy is heard. In the King James, Joshua 2:12-13 reads, and I quote, King James, "Now therefore I pray you, swear unto me by the Lord, that ye will save alive my father and my mother and deliver our lives from death." The plea here is urgent and personal. Life is at stake, and the oath binds Israel to mercy. In the Ethiopian record, the same request is carried with emphasis on covenant, faithfulness, rather than desperation. She says in the Ethiopian, and I quote, "Now swear to me by the Lord that you will preserve my father and my mother and deliver our lives from death." The appeal here rests on the character of God being honored, not merely on Israel's power to destroy or spare. It's a big difference. So the spies respond not with hesitation, but with oath. In both records, they bind themselves to preserve Rahab and her household. This should matter because it happens before Jericho falls, not after. Mercy is not improvised in the aftermath of judgment. It is embedded within it from the beginning. Now, the moment establishes a governing principle for the entire book here. Judgment in Joshua is not indiscriminate. It is not blind. Faith, alignment, and recognition of God matter, even when they arise from outside Israel. Rahab is not spared because Israel is generous. She is spared because covenant reality is recognized and honored. So the Ethiopian cadence, it preserves this as relational consistency rather than an exception. Well, I guess we'll save you because you saved us. Rahab is not an anomaly that contradicts conquest. She reveals that logic, or the logic that governs it. And where there is alignment with God's truth, there is preservation of life. So this placement also answers a critical question before it can be asked. If Joshua were meant to portray God as raging against peoples indiscriminately, Rahab would not be here. Her story would basically undermine that portrayal. So instead, her story defines the limits and purpose of judgment before the wall falls. This is to show that God also knows there are people who are innocent, who never made the decisions that the city made, and God is going to spare them and mercy them. Joshua does not begin by erasing distinction between the righteous and the wicked. It begins by showing that distinction still operates even under judgment. Mercy is not suspended when the land is entered. It is clarified. And those who have the mindset of Israelites' God coming are going to be spared. This is basically the good God saying, hey, I'm warning you, we're coming in. And just lay low and you'll be fine. Fight against us, you will not survive. And so Rahab basically did that, and she was spared. And this shows from the beginning of the book that God is a merciful God, not an angry God. And by placing Rahab first, the narrative teaches the reader how to listen to everything that follows after. Judgment will come, but it will not erase God's responsiveness to faith. Covenant is not ethnic, it is relational. And that truth governs Joshua from the start. Now, the crossing of the Jordan is deliberately framed as repetition and not escalation. Joshua does not introduce a new kind of divine power. It reenacts what has already been revealed. So the people understand that the God who led them out is the same God who leads them in. The way this moment is voiced determines whether God is heard as forcing entry into the land or guiding his people forward in ordered obedience. In the King James Record, Joshua 3:7-8 establishes this continuity plainly. It says, and I quote King James, "And the Lord said unto Joshua, This day I will begin to magnify thee in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that, as I was with Moses, so I will be with thee." And it continues, "And thou shalt command the priests that bear the ark of the covenant, saying, When ye are come to the brink of the water of Jordan, ye shall stand still in Jordan." Okay, the emphasis here falls on authority and recognition. Joshua is publicly affirmed, and the priests are commanded to stand in the river itself. Now, read quickly, this can sound like a dramatic display of power meant to assert dominance. But in the Ethiopian Tewahedo record, the same passage is carried with steadier progression. And it says, and I quote, Tewahedo, Ethiopian, "And the Lord said to Joshua, Today I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, so that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. And you shall command the priests who carry the ark of the covenant, saying, When you come to the edge of the waters of the Jordan, stand still in the Jordan." Well, the substance is the same, but the cadence emphasizes continuity rather than spectacle. Joshua is not elevated to replace Moses. He is confirmed to continue what Moses carried. And what follows reinforces this restraint, as in the King James, Joshua 3:13 reads, King James, and I quote, "And it shall come to pass, as soon as the soles of the feet of the priests that bear the ark of the Lord shall rest in the waters of Jordan, that the waters of Jordan shall be cut off." Now, the miracle responds to obedience. The waters do not part before movement. They part after alignment. In the Ethiopian record, the same sequence is preserved without any compression. It says, Ethiopian, I quote, "And it shall be, When the soles of the feet of the priests who carry the ark of the Lord rest in the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off. The order remains intact. God does not overwhelm the land to prove power. He responds to faithful movement taken in trust. This distinction matters because it shapes how divine action is understood. The crossing is not coercive. The river is not conquered. It yields when obedience steps forward. As God does not clear the path in advance to fear, so fear is removed. He asks for trust first, then confirms it. Joshua then interprets the event for the people in the King James. Joshua says in 3:10, and I quote King James, "Hereby ye shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will without fail drive out from before you the Canaanites," unquote. The future judgment is named here, but it is grounded in presence. God is known first as living among his people, not as destroying their enemies. Now, in the Ethiopian record, the same declaration holds the same balance. And I quote Ethiopian, "By this you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will surely drive out before you the Canaanites." Presence precedes judgment. God is not defined by what he removes, but by the fact that he dwells with his people. The crossing itself unfolds slowly, and the priests stand, the people pass, the river remains held back until all have crossed. And in both records, the detail is very careful. Nothing rushes, nothing surges uncontrollably. The miracle is governed and not explosive. This moment actually mirrors the Red Sea deliberately so the people do not imagine that they are dealing with a new or harsher God now that conquest has begun. The same God who restrained the waters before restrains them again. The same God who required trust before movement now does the same thing. Joshua 4 reinforces this, the 4th chapter, reinforces this further through a memorial. Stones, I believe there were 12, stones are taken from the riverbed so the event will be remembered, not mythologized. This is making a covenant, an agreement that we will all remember we crossed here these 12 stones. In both records, the purpose is explicit, so future generations will ask and the story will be told accurately. Memory is guarded so power is not misinterpreted. Well, the Ethiopian cadence consistently preserves this as instruction and remembrance rather than any type of a spectacle, as the King James implies. The King James preserves the same structure, though its elevated phrasing can make the moment feel more dramatic if read without attention to this sequence. So the crossing of the Jordan teaches how everything in Joshua should be heard. God goes before his people, but he does not trample order. He confirms obedience, but he does not remove responsibility. He makes a way, but he requires trust to step into it. Joshua does not enter the land by force. He enters it by following the ark. That distinction governs the severity that follows and prevents the book from being heard as uncontrolled violence, which most people read, the King James. It just looks like they keep messing up and God keeps kicking their ass. Well, the land is entered the same way that the journey began, by trusting the presence of God to lead, restrain, and guide every step forward. Jericho is the moment where Joshua is most often used to define God as violent, impulsive, and enraged. And because of that, the way this account is heard should matter more than anywhere else in this entire book, the Bible. When the language is rushed, Jericho sounds like explosive wrath. When the language is heard in sequence, Jericho reveals restraint, warning, and obedience governing judgment. The narrative begins not with assault, but with instruction. In the King James record, Joshua 6, 2-5, opens with clarity and limitation. King James, I quote, "And the Lord said unto Joshua, See, I have given into thine hand Jericho, and ye shall compass the city, and all ye men of war. Thus shalt thou do 6 days." So this action here is highly controlled. No attack is authorized. The people are told to walk, not strike, Time is built into the command, preventing impulsive action. Now, in the Ethiopian Tewahedo record, the same instruction is preserved with equal restraint. It says, I quote Ethiopia, "And the Lord said to Joshua, See, I have given Jericho into your hand. You shall go around the city, all the fighting men. Thus you shall do for 6 days." So nothing here is accelerated. Nothing here is dramatized. The city is not stormed. It is encircled patiently under command. Now, this matters because judgment is delayed intentionally. 6 days pass with no violence. The inhabitants of Jericho are not taken by surprise. They are given time to see, to hear, and to respond. Rahab's earlier story proves that response is possible. Jericho does not fall because God is impatient. It falls after warning, time, and opportunity have been extended. And this is something that we are not taught in the church because we're taught they went in, kicked it their ass, moved on to the promised land. That's not what happened. They did it as nicely as a God can do it. But that's not what the King James gives the impression of in its tone. So silence is also commanded. In the King James, Joshua 6:10 records, and I quote King James, "And Joshua had commanded the people, saying, Ye shall not shout, nor make any noise with your voice, until the day I bid you shout." So the people are restrained, emotion is governed. This is not a mob unleashed. It is obedience held under discipline. The Ethiopian record actually carries the same command with equal force. It says, and I quote Ethiopian, "And Joshua commanded the people, saying, You shall not shout or let your voice be heard until the day I say to you, shout." Now, the restraint is intentional. Judgment is not fueled by passion. It is executed only when command is given. When the walls fall, the text remains measured. In the King James, Joshua 6:20 says, and I quote King James, "So the people shouted when the priests blew with the trumpets, and the wall fell down flat." So the collapse follows obedience exactly. There is no escalation beyond what was commanded. The Ethiopian record preserves the same sequence. It says, I quote the Ethiopian, "So the people shouted when the trumpets were blown, and the wall fell down flat." The miracle is not violent in description. The walls fail. They fall. The city becomes accessible. The act is decisive, but it's not chaotic. The destruction that follows is severe, and it must be faced honestly, as in the King James, Joshua 6:21 reads, King James, I quote, "And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and women, young and old," unquote. So that language there in the King James is stark, and it cannot be softened away, but it must be heard inside everything that preceded it: warning, time, silence, obedience, and restraint. The Ethiopian record carries the same outcome, but without amplifying spectacle. It says, and I quote Ethiopian, "And they destroyed everything in the city, both men and women, young and old." The event is recorded and not embellished. The text does not linger. It does not glorify the destruction. It moves forward. And immediately mercy is named again. In both records, Rahab and her household are spared exactly as promised. The oath is honored even after judgment falls. This is crucial. Mercy is not overridden by victory. Covenant integrity remains binding. And Jericho teaches that judgment in Joshua is not indiscriminate rage. It is governed action carried out under command, time, warning, and restraint. The people are not allowed to fight when they want, shout when they want, or act when emotion rises. Everything is bounded. If God were being portrayed as angry and uncontrolled, none of this structure would be necessary. The 6 days would be irrelevant. The silence would be pointless. The oath to Rahab would be expendable. Instead, the narrative insists on discipline at every step. So Jericho falls, not because God erupts, he's angry, mad, but because obedience completes what has long been declared. The severity is real, but it is not impulsive. It is the outcome of a process governed from start to finish. And we know by Rahab that God spared those who trusted in the Israelites' God. They were spared. We knew this from Rahab. And God tells us, I will spare those who will get out of the way. But those who didn't get out of the way, who fell in love with their city and fell in love with the leadership and wanted their city and keep their city, they were all destroyed. Now, when heard carefully, Jericho does not reveal a God who delights in destruction. Not at all. It reveals a God who executes judgment without abandoning order, mercy, or even faithfulness. The walls fall, but restraint never does. And the people had all the time, 6 days, to get out, and they did not. Rahab stayed because she knew she'd be spared. This moment sets the whole boundary for how all subsequent battles must be heard. Joshua's not permission for violence. It is testimony that even judgment operates under command, timing, and covenant integrity, and God gives them a way out. The city would not budge. They didn't think that they were going to be raided. That's on them. Those people could have left. If Jericho is heard as rage, it is because the sequence has been completely ignored. When the sequence is preserved, the severity speaks without distorting the character of God. Now, the next part addresses what immediately follows Jericho, because the text intentionally refuses to let victory stand alone. If Joshua were meant to present God as driven by anger or bloodlust, the narrative would move quickly from conquest to conquest. But instead, the very next episode is failure, exposure, and correction. The placement here is deliberate, and the wording determines whether God is heard as volatile or as governing covenant integrity without partiality. In the King James record, Joshua 7 opens with a very sober shift in tone. It says, King James, I quote, "But the children of Israel committed a trespass in the accursed thing. For Achan took of the accursed thing, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against the children of Israel," unquote. So here, King James, the language immediately attributes the coming failure to covenant violation, not military weakness. However, the phrase anger of the Lord was kindled can sound emotionally explosive if isolated, as though God lashes out collectively for an individual sin. Now, the Ethiopian Tewahedo record preserves the same event with a different emphasis. It says, and I quote, Ethiopian, "But the children of Israel acted unfaithfully regarding what was devoted. For Achan took what was set apart, and the Lord was displeased with the children of Israel." The violation is named as unfaithfulness rather than provocation. The focus rests on broken trust, not divine temper. The displeasure arises from covenant breach and not irritation. Complete different view altogether. So the consequence unfolds through restraint, but not immediate punishment, as Israel is not struck down arbitrarily. They attempt I and fail. And in the King James, Joshua 7:4-5 records, and I quote King James, "So there went up thither of the people about 3,000 men, and they fled before the men of Ai, and smote of them about 36 men." So here the loss is small, controlled, and humiliating rather than catastrophic. God does not annihilate Israel for the sin. He allows exposure. Now, the Ethiopian record preserves this proportionality. It says, and I quote Ethiopian, "So about 3,000 men went up there, but they fled before the men of Ai, and about 36 men fell." Well, the defeat is measured. It reveals vulnerability without destroying the people. This should matter because it shows judgment operating as correction rather than extermination. Joshua's response is grief and confusion, not fear of an angry God. In the King James, Joshua 7:6-7 says, and I quote King James, "And Joshua rent his clothes and said, Alas, O Lord God, wherefore hast thou at all brought this people over Jordan?" Joshua does not recoil from God. He goes directly to him, speaking honestly. This would be unthinkable if God were being portrayed as volatile and unsafe. The Ethiopian record carries the same posture. It says, and I quote Ethiopian, "And Joshua tore his garments and said, Why have you brought this people across the Jordan?" The relationship remains intact. Lament is allowed. Questioning is not punished. God's response is instructive and not explosive. In the King James, Joshua 7:10-11 reads, and I quote King James, "Get thee up, wherefore liest thou thus upon thy face? Israel hath sinned." So there's no emotional tirade here. God identifies the issue clearly and precisely. Responsibility is named so restoration can occur. Now, in the Ethiopian wording, it preserves the clarity without sharpness. It says, and I quote, "Ethiopian, rise up. Why do you lie on your face? Israel has sinned." The focus is on action, not accusation. And if you've been reading the other books that we've been reading all the way up until now, you would understand that God isn't saying, "You're in trouble because I'm mad at you. You're in trouble because you forgot that sin leads to death. You forgot that I can't take care of you if you do evil things." Period. So the focus is on action and not accusation against them. He's like, Israel sinned. I told you, I warned you. Remember the laws that I put into place. So the problem must be addressed, but not dramatized. So the process that follows is careful, transparent, and communal. Lots are cast, and the guilty party is identified slowly, publicly, and lawfully. So this is not rage-driven punishment. It is covenant adjudication. In both records, the same sequence is preserved, and there are no shortcuts taken. When Achan, I don't know how you pronounce it, confesses the King James records his words in Joshua 7:20 says, King James, I quote, "Indeed I have sinned against the Lord God of Israel, and thus have I done." Well, responsibility is acknowledged without coercion. Well, the Ethiopian record mirrors this same confession. It says, and I quote, "Ethiopian, truly have I sinned against the Lord, the God of Israel, and this is what I did." The confession stands as voluntary truth-telling, not forced admission under terror, as we get implied from the King James. So the final judgment here is severe and cannot be denied. Achan and what belonged to him are destroyed. But even here, the text refuses spectacle, as the event is recorded, not glorified. And immediately after, the covenant order is then restored. In the King James, Joshua 7:26 concludes, "So the Lord turned from the fierceness of his anger," unquote. Read carelessly, this can sound like an emotional volatility resolving itself. Well, the Lord calmed down, sat down, and had a beer in a joint. I'm all right now. But in the Ethiopian record, the conclusion is framed completely different. Read this, get this. And I quote, Ethiopian, "So the Lord turned away from his displeasure." The shift here is relational and juridical, but it's not emotional. Order has been restored. The breach has been addressed. God turns around, starts working on something else. That is so different than the angry God we're all used to bowing to our knees from, and giving him the right. That's not what he wants. So what this should be what this is teaching, it should be understood as decisive. Victory does not excuse disobedience. God does not overlook covenant violation because conquest has begun. At the same time, God does not destroy his people in anger. He exposes, he corrects, he restores, and he continues. Robert Gertison says, "Hi, y'all. I'm packing for Cancun again. I forgot to log on. Glad to catch the end." Man, Robert Gertison has the life. Have fun over there, buddy. Joshua refuses to let readers believe that God's severity is arbitrary. Judgment here is targeted, proportional, and restorative to the whole community. The people are not abandoned. Leadership is not revoked. The mission continues. If Joshua were intended to depict an angry God, well, this chapter would look very different. The loss would be massive. The people would scatter. Joshua would be silenced, and none of that happens. Instead, covenant integrity is preserved even when it costs. So God is shown as impartial, not volatile. Victory does not corrupt justice. Mercy does not cancel holiness. So This entire chapter forces a recalibration after Jericho, as power does not belong to Israel. Obedience does. And God's presence does not guarantee success when covenant is violated. But neither does violation erase relationship. Because that one man sinned, the entire people got in trouble. They could not kick AI's ass. And people died. And God's like, hey, I've told you before, are you not listening to me? You cannot covet, which is what this man did. He took treasure that did not belong to him and he hid it. And his action cost lives. And he knew he hid it and did it and was hoping that no one would know. Even after they've seen all the supernatural events that God has shown them, he knew what he was doing. So AI, the city, AI, reveals that Joshua is not about divine rage unleashed on enemies and allies alike. It is about a God who governs with consistency, exposing sin without destroying the people he has committed himself to shepherd. And without this chapter, Jericho could be misheard. With it, the book makes its position unmistakable, meaning since we have the Ethiopian Tewahedo book to compare with the King James, which I'm not saying the King James is wrong, I'm saying it just portrays God as evil. We're getting a whole new way of looking at God. Thank you to Ethiopia. Next, we will show a different kind of danger than Jericho or AI, as no walls are falling here and no army is overwhelming Israel. The threat here is confidence, the subtle moment when leaders start interpreting reality by appearances instead of by the Lord's counsel. And Joshua slows down on purpose so the audience learns that covenant failure is not always rebellion. Sometimes it's simply acting like God is no longer needed. What's up, Texas militia? Here is the hinge verse written plainly so it lands clean when read aloud. King James Bible, Joshua 9:14 says, quote, "And the men took of their victuals and asked not counsel at the mouth of the Lord," unquote. Now, that single line explains the entire disaster without blaming weakness, lack of resources, or bad intelligence. But the problem is spiritual procedure and not military inability. In the Ethiopian Working Translation, the same moment is carried with the same meaning, but it tends to read more like a relational failure than a dramatic courtroom charge. The Ethiopian rendering, Joshua 9:14, is commonly expressed along the lines of, quote, "They took some of their provisions, but they did not inquire of the Lord." Well, the weight lands on the absence of inquiry, not on God flaring up an emotion. So the audience hears, "They moved without him," not "he snapped at them." Big difference. Once the deception is uncovered, the text becomes a test of integrity. King James Bible, Joshua 9:19-20 says, and I quote King James, "But all the princes said unto all the congregation, We have sworn unto them by the Lord God of Israel. Now therefore we may not touch them. This we will do to them. We will even let them live, lest wrath be upon us because of the oath which we swore unto them." Now, even in the old phrasing, the point is clear. Israel refuses to use power to erase a vow, even when a vow was entered foolishly. Now, in the Ethiopian translation, the same section usually sounds less like God is personally angry and more like covenant consequences real. In the Ethiopian rendering, the English that we did, Joshua 9:19-20 is typically rendered in the same sense of, quote, Ethiopian. "We have sworn to them by the Lord, therefore we must not harm them. We will let them live, so that judgment does not come upon us because of the oath." So the moral force here is the same, but the tone often feels more like sober accountability than fear of an offended temper. The audience is guided to hear holiness as binding reality and not just mood. Do you understand what I'm saying here? Joshua then confronts the Gibeonites directly, and the words are blunt without being chaotic. King James Bible, Joshua 9:22-23 says, and I quote King James, "Wherefore have ye beguiled us, saying, We are very far from you when ye dwell among us. Now therefore ye are cursed, and there shall none of you be freed from being bondmen and hewers of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God, unquote. So this is not indiscriminate slaughter. It is a judicial outcome that preserves life but assigns consequence. So the text is showing restraint. The oath stands, yet deception does not become cost-free. Now, in the Ethiopian Working Translation, the same confrontation typically keeps the same structure, but it can feel more like placement under covenant order than like humiliation for humiliation's sake. Ethiopian rendition that we've done, Joshua 9:22 through 23 is often carried in the sense of, quote, "Why did you deceive us? Now you shall not cease to be servants, woodcutters, and water carriers of the house of my God." So life is preserved, the oath is honored, and the community is protected from repeating the same vulnerability, but it's completely worded different. So the audience here, they actually hears that mercy and consequence can't coexist without turning God into a tyrant, which is what the King James does. So the chapter there closes with action that is firm and contained. It's not escalating. King James Bible, Joshua 9:26 through 27 says, I quote King James, "And so did he unto them and delivered them out of the hand of the children of Israel, that they slew them not. And Joshua made them that day hewers of wood and drawers of water for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord," unquote. So the final emphasis is not on punishment, but on restraint and order. They were not killed, and the situation was stabilized inside covenant boundaries. And this is one more place that Joshua refuses to be a rage narrative, because the text itself keeps showing power being restrained by oath, by procedure, and by the fear of God understood as covenant reality. So as they continue living it, they start to understand that their lives make all of the world around them easier to manage because they're not living in sin. Now, God isn't mad at your sin. God's saying, I'm not mad at you doing it. I'm saying if you do it, I can't protect you from the devil. Okay? So the conflict that follows is not chosen for expansion or conquest. It's inherited through covenant obligation. Joshua does not march south because he desires territory. He moves because the sworn word now binds Israel to protect those who align themselves with the Lord. And this distinction is very critical because it reframes the entire campaign as responsibility fulfilled, not violence pursued. And the summons from the Gibeon. In the King James record, Joshua 10:6 through 7 says, "And the men of Gibeon sent unto Joshua, saying, Slack not thy hand from thy servants, come up to us quickly and save us. So Joshua ascended from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him," unquote. The movement is reactive, not aggressive. Joshua responds to a call for help that exists only because Israel honored its oath. In the Ethiopian Working Translation, the same moment is preserved with equal clarity and without escalation. Joshua 10:6 through 7 is typically rendered in the same sense of, quote, Ethiopian. "The men of Gibeon sent to Joshua, saying, Do not withdraw your hand from your servants. Come up quickly and save us. And Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all his fighting men with him." Well, the tone remains obligation-driven. Joshua is not launching a campaign. He is answering covenant responsibility. So before battle unfolds, God speaks again, and what he says governs how the violence must be heard. In the King James, Joshua 10:8 reads, "And the Lord," I quote King James, "And the Lord said unto Joshua, Fear them not, for I have delivered them into thine hand. There shall not a man of them stand before thee." Fear is addressed here, but not anger stirred. The reassurance stabilizes Joshua so he does not hesitate or abandon the oath under pressure. In the Ethiopian Working Translation, Joshua 10:8 is usually carried along the same lines of, and I quote, Ethiopia. "And the Lord said to Joshua, Do not fear them, for I have given them into your hand. Not one of them shall stand before you." So the emphasis again rests on steadiness, not fury. God is removing fear so covenant can be kept, not inflaming passion so destruction increases. So the battle itself unfolds quickly, and the text refuses to dwell on spectacle. Confusion breaks enemy coordination, and the outcome is very decisive. Then the most debated moment appears, and it must be heard carefully. In the King James, Joshua 10:12 through 13 reads, and I quote King James, "Then spoke Joshua to the Lord, and he said in the sight of Israel, Sun," it says S-U-N, "stand thou still upon Gibeon, and thou moon in the valley of Ajalon," or Aelon. I think it's A-I-A-L-O-N. "And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed, until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies." Now, read here without any care, this can sound like cosmic disruption unleashed to satisfy bloodlust. But in the Ethiopian Working Translation, the same moment is usually carried with a different cadence that emphasizes delay rather than upheaval. Joshua 10:12-13 is commonly rendered in the same sense of, and I quote, Ethiopian. "Joshua spoke to the Lord and said before Israel, let the sun remain over Gibeon and the moon over the valley of Aelon. And the sun delayed and the moon remained until the people completed judgment on their enemies." So the emphasis here is not on the universe breaking, but on the time being held so obligation can be completed without panic or retreat. The King James Version continues to shock me as it's so written as this really angry God. No wonder we have agnostics and atheists alike. So that distinction should matter when spoken aloud, guys. One hearing imagines creation being under rage or bending under rage. God just can't hold himself. And the other hears restraint under responsibility. So the request is not for excess violence, but for sufficient time so covenant duty does not fail midstream. And once the obligation is fulfilled, the intervention then ends. The text itself marks the moment as unique and unrepeatable, preventing it from becoming precedent or pattern. So after this, the narrative tightens instead of expanding as kings are dealt with. Justice is completed. The campaign closes. There is no escalation, no intoxication with power, no drift into excess. In both traditions, the text moves on quickly, signaling that the intervention was limited to purpose and then withdrawn. And what this part reveals is decisive for how Joshua must be read. Even at its most dramatic point, the book refuses to abandon restraint. God intervenes narrowly, not endlessly. Time is held briefly, not broken. Severity appears, but it is contained by covenant obligation and not driven by divine rage. So this is not conquest accelerating out of control. It is responsibility being honored under pressure. The land is not taken in frenzy. It's secured through faithfulness to a sworn word. And when the task is complete, intervention then stops. So Joshua 10 does not portray a God who delights in violence or bends creation to satisfy anger. It portrays a God who ensures covenant integrity is upheld, even when doing so requires extraordinary but carefully bounded intervention. An obligation is fulfilled, order returns, and the narrative moves forward without excess. And, you don't understand also the context of the cities that they're taking over. These cities were horrible to other cities. They were they were doing exactly what American leaders are doing. They were dividing and conquering and pillaging and taking and killing. I think God was doing them a favor. So this reinforces the pattern established since the Jordan. God goes as far as covenant requires and no further. When the purpose is complete, then restraint can resume. So after the intensity of battle, the narrative deliberately slows down. Joshua does not surge forward intoxicated by victory. It settles into consolidation, order, and restraint. This shift is intentional because conquest without boundaries would distort covenant. What follows reveals whether God's posture hardens as power increases or whether governance becomes more measured. Now, the campaigns do not continue endlessly. The text marks closure. Kings are listed, not celebrated. Victories are recorded, not dramatized. The land is not described as seized in frenzy, but as subdued in stages. And the language resists triumphalism and instead emphasizes completion, meaning they're being good. And with that good comes humility, and they're acting humility. They're not taking over the world. They didn't have to. They just had to follow the commandments of God and keep them. That was it. So time passes. The wars come to an end. Joshua is described as old, and the shift in tone matters. Strength gives way to stewardship. Momentum gives way to distribution. And if Joshua were a book driven by rage, this pause would not exist. Instead, restraint governs what happens next. The land is then divided carefully, boundaries are named, inheritance is assigned by lot and not by favoritism or power. The process is slow and deliberate. No tribe seizes what it wants. No leader enriches himself. Order replaces urgency. And in both canonical traditions, the Levites are treated differently. They are not given territory like the others. Their inheritance is the Lord himself. And this detail anchors the entire distribution process, as possession is not the highest good. Presence of God is. Cities of refuge are established in the middle of this distribution. This placement is critical. Before borders are fully settled, protection is provided for those who act without intent. Mercy is built into the land before conflict fully ends, and justice is bounded by compassion. And the language around refuge does not sound angry or punitive. It actually sounds very careful. Bloodshed is restrained. Vengeance is limited. Process replaces impulse. God's law creates space for truth to be examined rather than assumed. So Joshua also ensures that the altar across the Jordan does not become a cause for civil war. When misunderstanding arises, inquiry comes before violence. Representatives are sent. Explanation is heard. Unity is preserved without any bloodshed. So this moment matters deeply, as power could have justified immediate retaliation. Instead, restraint governs response. Words are exchanged. Memory is clarified. Brotherhood is preserved. Covenant holds. And if we could all just act like these people at this time, things would be so much better. Now, the God revealed here is not escalating judgment. He is stabilizing peace. As war gives way to governance, authority gives way to accountability, and strength gives way to stewardship. Joshua slows deliberately so that violence does not become identity, and the people are taught how to live in the land without turning power into chaos. This is formation, not domination. And this confirms what has been unfolding all along. Severity does not grow with success. It diminishes as order is established. Thus, the land is not held by fear, but by structure, memory, and restraint. So Joshua does not end its story in blood. It turns toward life organized under covenant and agreement. And that turn is intentional, and it dismantles the myth of an angry God driving conquest without limit. Now, as Joshua's life draws to a close, the text deliberately shifts from battle to testimony. The land is largely settled. The people are no longer reacting to threat. And what remains is memory. And that memory is where covenant either survives or quietly dissolves. Joshua speaks now not as a general, but as a witness. In the King James Record, Joshua opens his address with a declaration meant to stabilize truth before warning is heard. Joshua 23:3 states in the King James, I quote, "And ye have seen all that the Lord your God hath done unto all these nations, because of you, for the Lord your God is he that hath fought for you," unquote. So here in the King James, victory is immediately attributed away from human strength. The people are reminded that success did not originate in themselves. And the Ethiopian Tewahedo Record preserves the same grounding without altering tone at all. It says, and I quote in Ethiopian, "You have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake, for it is the Lord your God who fought for you." The emphasis remains on divine action, not human achievement. Memory is anchored so pride does not rewrite history. Joshua then affirms covenant reliability before any warning appears. In the King James, Joshua 23:14 declares, this is King James, and I quote, "Not one thing hath failed of all the good things which the Lord your God spake concerning you. All are come to pass unto you, and not one thing hath failed thereof." So here faithfulness is established first. God's consistently is stated as fact, not as incentive. The Ethiopian record carries the same assurance with equal clarity. It says, and I quote, Ethiopian, "Not one word of all the good things that the Lord your God spoke concerning you has failed. All have come to pass for you." So the order here matters. Promise fulfillment is spoken before consequence is named. And only after this does Joshua speak warning, and the warning through the words reveal posture. In the King James, Joshua says in 23:15-16, it says, I quote King James, "Therefore it shall come to pass that all good things are come upon you. So shall the Lord bring upon you all evil things when ye have transgressed the covenant of the Lord your God." So here read carelessly or under an angry God, this can sound like threat, but the structures ties consequences to departure, not divine volatility. The Ethiopian Tewahedo text preserves the same logic without hardening its tone. It says, and I quote, Ethiopian, "And it shall be that just as all the good words that the Lord your God spoke to you have come upon you, so the Lord will bring upon you all the difficult things until he has destroyed you from this land, if you transgress the covenant of your Lord." So the outcome is conditional here, and it's not impulsive. Alignment governs result, meaning, hey, break the 10 commandments, all transgressions are coming towards you, and there's nothing you can do. You read this in the Ethiopian, you understand God and why he put the commands there in the first place, to get you closer to him. The closer you are to God, the more protected you are. The more you just don't want to hang out with God, the more destruction comes. So the outcome is conditional, not impulsive. Alignment governs result. Joshua then presses the point again, but not with rage, but with clarity. In the King James, I quote Joshua 24:14-15, it records, King James, I quote, "Now therefore fear the Lord, and serve him in sincerity and in truth. Choose you this day whom you will serve." So the command is not coercive. Choice is explicitly preserved. The Ethiopian record echoes this invitation without delusion, like diluting it. It says, quote, Ethiopian, "Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and truth. Choose yourselves today whom you will serve." So covenant is not enforced through terror. It is entered through a decision. Joshua then makes a statement that is often misheard as severity in the King James. Joshua 24:19 actually reads, and I quote King James, "Ye cannot serve the Lord, for he is an holy God. He is a jealous God." Well, read in isolation under an angry God, this can sound like rejection. But the sentence continues to clarify that divided allegiance is the issue, not incapacity to love God. The Ethiopian wording preserves this distinction more gently. It says, I quote Ethiopian, "You cannot serve the Lord if you turn away, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God." Well, the warning here is about contradiction, not exclusion. Covenant cannot coexist with divided loyalty. So the people respond, and their response is not silenced or overridden. In both records, they insist on serving the Lord. Joshua does not dismiss them. He binds their words as testimony, making their choice accountable. The chapter closes not with a threat, but with covenant renewal. Stones are set up as a witness. Words are recorded. Memory is sealed, so future generations cannot claim ignorance. This totally matters because Joshua ends exactly where Moses ended, with a choice, not fear. The God revealed here does not erupt in anger at the edge of success. He speaks plainly so success does not become betrayal. So this should confirm that the entire book has been showing God does not rule through volatility. He governs through faithfulness, consequence, and choice. Judgment is not sudden wrath. It is the outworking of alignment abandoned. So Joshua's final witness does not terrify. It clarifies. You should have a pretty good understanding of the book of Joshua at this point, especially during between the Ethiopian and the King James Bible. The people are not driven away trembling. They are left standing with a decision that cannot be blamed on circumstance. So memory here is preserved, covenant is spoken, choice is honored. The children of Israel did not have to stay in Israel. And the ones who stayed, who purposely didn't want to stay, sinned against Israel. And that had to be dealt with. So this kept everyone in line, meaning all neighbors knew what their neighbors were up to. And everyone knew who was the person that was hiding the gold. They all knew it. This is a way of keeping everyone together in trust. And this is and we haven't lived in a society like that since. And I don't think we will until Jesus actually comes for the last time. As I do believe we're living in Satan's little season. So Joshua does not close with an angry God. Memory is preserved. Covenant is spoken. Choice is honored. It actually closes with a faithful God who refuses to lie about where forgetting leads. So the book of Joshua does not end with the conquest. It ends with testimony sealed into the land, so the story cannot later be rewritten as rage, ambition, or unchecked violence. The final words and actions matter because endings reveal intent. How Joshua closes determines how everything before it must be heard. Now, in the King James record, Joshua's death is stated simply without drama or embellishment. Joshua 24:29 reads, and I quote, "And it came to pass after these things that Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died being 110 years old." So there is no language of triumph, no recounting of enemies defeated, no celebration of power. Joshua is identified by a single title, servant of the Lord. His authority is framed by obedience and not domination. The Ethiopian Tewahedo record preserves the same restraint and identity. And it says, Ethiopian, I quote, "And after these things, Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died being 110 years old. Nothing is added, nothing is glorified. The life is closed as it was lived. Under service, not conquest. Joshua is then buried within the inheritance he helped secure." In the King James, it says, "And they buried him in the border of his inheritance in Timnah Serah." Well, the leader rests among the people, not above them, among them. His legacy is not a monument of power, but faithfulness lived inside the land. The Ethiopian records this mirroring without any tonal shift, and they buried him within the boundary of his inheritance at Timnah Serah. So the burial confirms continuity. Joshua does not rule from beyond death. He returns to the soil like the people he served. And what this also proves to us is that how come some of the Ethiopian as to American to English almost match word for word to the King James, but some doesn't, because I believe they've been played around with. So the text then records something crucial about the generation that followed. In King James, Joshua 24:31 says, and I quote King James, "And Israel served the Lord all of the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that overlived Joshua and which had known all the works of the Lord." So faithfulness here is directly tied to memory. Service endures as long as witness remains alive. In the Ethiopian record, it preserves the same connection. It says, Ethiopian, I quote, "And Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua and who had known all the works of the Lord." So there's no suggestion for fear here that sustained obedience. Knowledge sustained obedience. Memory did. Relationship did. Covenant did. Keeping the commandments did. The book then reaches back even further, deliberately closing historical loops in the King James. 24:32, it says, King James, "And the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up out of Egypt, buried they in Shechem." Well, this detail is not incidental. Joshua ends by returning to Genesis. The promise spoken to Joseph generations earlier is honored quietly without spectacle, and the Ethiopian record carries the same fulfillment. "And the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up from Egypt, they buried at Shechem." So the story closes, but not with blood, okay? But with faithfulness across centuries. Promise is fulfilled without noise. And finally, the death of Eleazar the priest is recorded. In the King James, it states, I quote, "And Eleazar the son of Aaron died, and they buried him in a hill that pertained to Phinehas, his son," or Phineas. Well, leadership passes fully, priesthood continues, order remains, and the Ethiopian record again mirrors the same closure. Over and over and over and over. Joshua does not end with an angry God standing over ruins. Joshua ends with a faithful God standing behind history, having done exactly what he said he would do, and no more than he said he would do. So Joshua, to conclude, does not reveal a God who grows harsher once promise turns into possession. It reveals a God who remains consistent when responsibility replaces rescue. From the crossing of the Jordan to the final burial, the posture of God does not shift from patience to rage. What changes is the context in which obedience must be lived. Now, throughout the book, severity appears, but it is never unbounded. As judgment is real, but it is never impulsive. Intervention occurs, but it's always contained, purposeful, and followed by restraint. As mercy is not erased by conquest and covenant integrity is not suspended for victory. When the language is allowed to stand in sequence, Joshua consistently resists the caricature of an angry God, period. So the comparison between the King James wording and the Ethiopian Tewahedo record makes this especially clear. Where later English phrasing can sound abrupt, juridical, or emotionally charged, the Ethiopian cadence often preserves continuity, restraint, and relational logic. The events here don't change. The outcomes do not change. What changes is how God's character is heard while those events unfold. Joshua shows that obedience is not sustained by fear of divine volatility either, but by memory of divine faithfulness. The people are warned, but they are also reminded. They are corrected, but they're not discarded. And they are held accountable, but they are never treated as expendable. Even the most difficult moments are framed by order, process, and covenant responsibility. So the book also refuses to let violence become identity, as war gives way to distribution. Power gives way to stewardship. Victory gives way to testimony. The land is not secured through endless conquest, but through alignment, remembrance, and restraint. When misunderstanding arises, inquiry precedes bloodshed. When failure occurs, restoration follows repentance. When leadership ends, continuity remains. As Joshua closes the same way it opens, with service, not domination. The final witnesses are not enemies destroyed, but promises being fulfilled. Bones being buried and generations who remember. And that ending is not accidental. It actually seals how the book must be read. So this examination does not remove the weight of Joshua. It restores its coherence. The God revealed here is not a projection of human anger onto divine action. He is the same faithful covenant keeper revealed before the Jordan was ever crossed, governing carefully, correcting firmly, preserving mercy, and completing what he promised without excess. So Joshua teaches that when language is heard rightly, obedience then becomes trust rather than terror. Discipline becomes guidance rather than rejection. And judgment becomes consequence rather than rage. So the book does not instruct believers to fear God's anger. It instructs them to remember his faithfulness and live accordingly. Is that so hard? I mean, God, I don't know. So the work of comparison makes one thing unmistakable. The angry God many have been taught to see in Joshua is not created by the events of themselves. He is created by how the language has been carried. When the language is restored, just like we've done here on this show, the character of God comes back into focus. So Joshua does not end in fear, folks. It ends in faithfulness remembered. This has been Cause Before Symptom. Love you guys. Hope this helped. We'll see you tomorrow.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books on the breath war, the crown of blood, and the ritual machine. Fix your body by buying his award-winning detox formula, removing heavy metals and parasites. You'll feel better and live longer. Go to elitepotion.com. And one more thing, please. Just try and love your neighbor, because if you do, the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.